Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar as part of Sexual Violence Awareness Month. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join this conversation. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are all meeting on today, wherever that may be. I'm here on the Gold Coast on Bundjalung country, the land of the Yugambeh people and the Kumbamerri saltwater people. I recognise and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I recognise their deep spiritual connection to this land, their water and their millennia-old legacy. I recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and this was and always will be their land. I extend that respect to all First Nations people who may join us today also. Some support numbers that will be provided for you in the chat function by our facilitator, admin facilitator, Taylor, in the back end. If you feel like you need support throughout this webinar, please reach out and connect to us as well. Any of the facilitators that you see on the screen today would be really happy to talk to you should you feel like you need support or further information. So I'm Anushka, I'm from the MATE Bystander Program at Griffith University, and I'm very honoured to be moderating this panel among some amazing guest speakers here today and in partnership with DV Connect. This webinar is for members of the workforce who want to feel empowered to take action if they ever witness sexual harassment at work. DV Connect is hosting a webinar next Wednesday, especially for employers. If that is you, please join that webinar also. A little bit of a disclaimer, neither DV Connect or MATE can provide legal or industrial advice. So this webinar will be about awareness and referral to places that can provide these services if you need to. I'm not sure how many people we have joining us today, but if you would like to ask any questions, please use the chat function in Zoom. Type your questions in there. I can ask them to the panel members as we go through. They will also be able to see them and answer them as well. But if we've got a smaller group, even if we've got lots of people, share your questions and hopefully we can get to them and no one will walk away with any questions. But I hope that you will feel inspired today to take action and be someone who does something. So let me introduce today's speakers. First of all, Sian Ross-Smith from Griffith University's MATE Bystander Program. Sian wears many hats, like a lot of hats. She's the director of the Griffith's MATE Bystander Program and a very inspiring mentor and colleague to me. She is also a facilitator of a men's behaviour change program, and she is the chair of the board at DV Connect. When it comes to preventing violence against women in all of its forms, you will not find anyone more dedicated, passionate, or committed to that cause. Having the expertise and the experience of working at what we call both ends of the continuum in the response phase and the primary prevention phase, it gives Sian a holistic understanding of how we can all work together to prevent violence from occurring in the first place. Michelle is the Research Compliance and Inclusion Manager at DV Connect and has worked with women and children who have been affected by violence as well as men who use violence. Michelle has supported organisations to implement safe workplace policies and processes and awareness-raising events around sexual and domestic violence. Michelle has lived experience in both making a complaint about sexual harassment and managing sexual harassment complaints as a manager. Tracy is from DV Connect and has worked in the sector for over 10 years supporting women and children as survivors of domestic, family and sexual violence. Tracy supports the DV Connect Sexual Assault Helpline, which provides information, support and referral services to families and survivors impacted by sexual violence. What an incredible group of speakers we have today to share their experience with you. I'm going to hand over to Tracy to talk to us about what sexual harassment in the workplace looks like.
Thank you, Anushka. I'm so sorry, everyone. I couldn't find my unmute button. So I was just trying to figure that out. So I'm here to talk about how to recognize sexual violence or sexual harassment in the workplace. So talking about what it can look like, how does it present, and I guess what you can do if you see it. So to start off with, by way of definition, sexual harassment includes any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that causes, I guess, the person on the receiving end, it causes offense, it causes embarrassment, and it makes a person feel intimidated. So it's more about the impact on the person that is experiencing those behaviors as well. So in terms of how that might present in the workplace, it can present in kind of behaviors that fit 4 categories. So part of that would be physical acts, where there will be things like inappropriate touching, where there's obviously no consent and those behaviors are not invited by the person experiencing them. It can involve following people, looking at them in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable, which kind of sexual connotation or innuendos in terms of that physical or act of looking at someone. It also things like hugging, where that's not invited, or kissing, or just blocking someone's passage where they're wanting to walk through or walk past. There's also things that are other behaviors which showing people images of a sexual nature, where that again is uninvited and unwelcome. Things like showing pornographic images or images that are very explicit in nature, the sexual nature of them. Some of those behaviors as well that can present, they will be nonverbal. So in terms of when there's nonverbal, where it's more around the actions, how you make someone feel by the way that you look at them, and also sexual gestures, that could be a whole range of other behaviors that again have that undesired impact on the other person. Most of the behaviors are very verbal, which includes comments of a sexual nature, where we make the remarks are sexist in nature, maybe talking about someone's personal sexual life, repeated contact or repeated requests of sexual favors, commenting, I guess, on someone, what they're wearing, or invitations or requests for sex, where you can definitely see that those behaviors are not welcome with the other person. So some of those behaviors, some of those comments, some of those behaviors somehow have been normalized as part of society, where in the past they might have been condoned because that impact on the other people was not really taken into account or considered. But in the workplace, it does have the impact of making that environment really, really unsafe for the person at the receiving end of those behaviors. So I guess as part of, when you're working with people, or when you're in as employers, when you see some of those behaviors, part of that is then thinking about, when you see it, it's good to name it. It's good to call out those behaviors as well, because that allows people to feel there is that support for when they are experiencing those behaviors. So I suppose Shan will talk to you about the strategies on how to respond when those behaviors are identified, or when someone puts in discloses the behaviors around sexual harassment. But part of also what might happen is then, for those people that are responsible for those behaviors, you might find that there is minimization of the impact of their behaviors. And part of that could be, I suppose, not having awareness of the impacts of how those behaviors impact the person at the receiving end of that. But part of that also, which is the most important, I guess, is it's about, by denying those behaviors, it shifts that responsibility. So making people not take account, not be accountable for their behaviors. So I suppose in terms of when you see that, and once, finding ways of supporting that, there is a whole lot of support that is available for when you're needing to look at providing support to people that have been impacted by sexual harassment in the workplace. So one of that is through, as Taylor said, through DV Connect, via our sexual assault line, which is a 24-hour service. It's designed to provide information and support. So some of that is looking at checking those things out to say, this is what's been happening. Does that constitute sexual harassment? So the counselors on that line are very good at giving that information to talk about, so that at least, they can clarify some of those things that you're seeing. They can provide information around how best you can support that person. And as I said before, there is a whole range of services that can provide support for people. So I think that's all I can say about recognizing sexual harassment in the workplace, and I'll hand over to Sean.
Thanks, Tracy. That was really great and really informative. And I think a lot of people don't realise, or it's not as well known, that DV Connect actually offer, the sexual assault line. So I love the fact that you raised that as a place where people can go for support. So Nush, are you ready for me? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name's Shan. I'm the director of the MATE program. And the reason why I do MATE day in, day out is I am really focused on the prevention of violence against women. After working 15 long years in the criminal justice system, working at the response end, so working at people going to court, going to prison, coming back out of prison, and that kind of revolving cycle. And I was, by that stage, people's lives have been ruined, they've been destroyed, and they'll never be the same again at the hands of people that often claim to love them, whether it's domestic or sexual violence. And so for me, I became deeply passionate about prevention. And the reason I wanted to talk to you today about sexual harassment in the workplace is because to me, it's all about how do we as a collective shift and change the culture to what we want it to look and feel like? Because I suppose at the end of the day, it's up to us. I feel like sometimes we're waiting on the world to change, and yet actually the world, can change with advocacy and the role of the bystander. So I wanted to talk to everyone today about the role of the bystander in the prevention of sexual harassment. So here at MATE, we talk about the fact that everyone is a leader. Everyone has someone or many people in their life, in their sphere, who look to them. It may be that someone thinks you're really great at negotiating, or that you're really great at having difficult conversations, or you're really kind to other people, you're generous with your time. Whatever it is, there are certain people in your life right now that look to you for guidance and see you as a leader. And so when we all think about the fact that we are leaders, there are people that look to us. With that leadership comes a sense or a responsibility for us to do something with that leadership. So what kind of leader do I want to show up as every day? For me, I want to be the type of leader that leads with kindness, leads with integrity, and leads with doing the right thing. So that's, I suppose, where the role of the bystander comes in. If I'm leading with integrity and I'm leading with kindness, and I have a responsibility to do that, then when I see, hear, or sense something that isn't okay in the workplace, the onus is on me to do something about that. So I think for way too long, we've relied on a victim or survivor of sexual violence in the workplace to come forward, and the onus shouldn't fall squarely on them. If we've seen, heard, or sensed something, we are responsible for the culture that is operating around us. So the two things that I always say is, as an effective bystander, I have two really distinct, clear messages. One is that I have a responsibility to provide support to the person that's experiencing that violence. And I also have a role to hold that person that's using that violence accountable. And that's my role as a bystander. So the way in which I operate, and Anushka operates, is we're really keen to meet people where they're at. It's really important for me that we meet the victim where they're at, that this is something that has happened to them. So as an effective bystander, you never want to tell someone what they should do next or shouldn't do next. You never want to tell them what you would do if you're in that situation. You would never come at it from judgment or an expiry date, or you must do X, Y, and Z. So for me, an effective bystander is someone that provides that level of support and does certain things in that workplace to make it a better place for everyone to work. But before I get into some of those tips and tricks, I did want to highlight to everyone that to date, bystanders have, for the most part, done nothing. In communities, in schools, in workplaces, you name it, people have done mostly nothing. And it's not because we're not good humans, right? Because we are good humans. We want to do the right thing in society. It's mostly because we have all been socially conditioned around not intervening. You know, we've received messages our whole childhood that says, Sian, sit down, shut up, don't get involved, don't tittle-tale, don't come to me in the playground and tell me that they did that, sort it out yourself, I don't want to know about it. And or as a child, you were punished if, you know, you and your sibling were arguing and your parents just punished you both, regardless of who was at fault and who was perhaps trying to defend themselves. So we've received these both conscious and unconscious messages right throughout our childhoods saying, don't get involved. And then all of a sudden, as adults, we wonder why no one's getting involved. So for the first part of being an effective bystander is unlearning some of the messages that we've received throughout our childhood and into our adulthood. You think of your first job where you were basically told, hey, Sian, don't speak up, don't say anything, just, you know, settle in, know your place. So having that courage to unlearn some of that stuff is a really conscious thing that we all have to choose to do. There are other things that stand in the way of us intervening, like fear of getting it wrong, fear of accusing someone, fear of making it worse, the fear of social norms, what other people will think of you getting involved. But the main reason why we actually don't intervene is a thing called pluralistic ignorance. So it's Tracy, Miranda, Anushka aren't doing anything about it. And they are people that I look to for, you know, who would probably do something. They're not doing anything, therefore I'm not going to. Yeah, so it's that kind of comfort or safety of all of us, a diffusion of responsibility, really, all of us not doing anything in that moment. It's a little bit like if a fire alarm went off in your workplace and no one else got up and did anything, you might look around and think, I might look a bit silly if I get up and do something now. No one else is getting up. You know, how come Michelle's not getting up? She would get up if anyone was going to. She knows the workplace health and safety around here. So we get these messages from society constantly that prohibit us from doing what it is that we really inherently want to do. So I suppose part of what I do when I'm talking to people about being an effective bystander is I want people to really understand or unpack what it is what are the things that hold them back from intervening? You know, because usually it's your gut that says, oh, something just isn't right here. I'm sensing something isn't right here. And then you do this self-talk that can either be, don't be silly, Sian, you've got it wrong. That can't be what happened. You don't know all the information. You might make it worse. And so I shut that down. Instead, my internal dialogue has to be things like, but if not me, who? But there are ways I can work around that fear. That maybe no one else is doing anything because they don't know what to do. I'm sure there are people looking to me to be the one that's going to do something. So it's about a shift in our dialogue to ourselves, in our train of thought, in our dialogue. And it becomes quite an active thing that for me now, I've been doing this work for about 5 years, working in this bystander space. And you ask Anushka, I cannot walk past anything. I cannot not do anything about anything. And sometimes I'm embarrassing to people, but it's that real sense of, if not me, who? And even when my children are not with me, what type of leader would they want me to be? If I'm asking them to be good humans and do these certain things in the playground, then what is it that they would want from me? How could I be the best role model to them and to the other people in my life? But also, how can I reset culture? And I can reset that through actions. So I know everyone came here for, well, what can we do? And like I said earlier, Anushka and I are very much believers in meeting people where they're at, not publicly shaming someone, because we know a reaction to shame can often be something that doesn't always work. But in saying that, you and me are going to do two completely different things in a moment where we see, hear, or sense sexual harassment in the workplace. So if you were going to do something directly, you could walk up while you're hearing it, seeing it, sensing it, and saying, is everything okay here? And I always say, use that same language and same tone with the person who's experiencing that violence and the person that is the perpetrator of that violence. So the same tone, is everything okay here? Because it's a non-confrontational way to approach a situation, but it's still very direct. Is everything okay here? Is there anything I can do to help? I noticed, I had a sense that something wasn't okay. Is there anything I can do? So that's how you could directly intervene. But be ready for what comes next. So the perpetrator is not going to say to you, yeah, I'm actually sexually harassing the person standing in front of me right now, right? You're going to receive messages from the perpetrator that they're a really good human. You've got this all wrong. You've taken it out of context. I've heard that you do this type of thing before, Sian. So the messages coming back at you are not going to confirm what you thought was true. The messages from a victim, for the most part, will also be, I'm okay here, Sian, everything's okay here, nothing to see, right? Because that is for them about survival mode. Yeah, so in a public space like that, if you were going to directly intervene because you are really concerned about someone's safety, you're not going to get messages from either the victim experiencing it or the perpetrator that reinforce that what you're doing is right. You have to have the courage to know that what you were doing was the right thing, right? Now, if you get it wrong, say sexual harassment wasn't happening and you've intervened and said, is everything okay? And it absolutely categorically wasn't happening. What have you lost? Because in that moment, you've shown both those colleagues your integrity. You've shown both those colleagues, oh, well, you know, that's the person I am. I'm going to speak up if I sense something that isn't okay. Off on our way, right? You haven't lost anything. Oftentimes we worry about losing something, but actually you've got a lot to gain by being that person that says, I'm going to, you know, stand by my values in this organization. You might indirectly intervene. So it might be that you approach the person experiencing the violence afterwards and say, hey, I saw what happened back there. Are you okay? How do I best support you? It might be that you have that very same conversation with the person who's just committed the sexual harassment. Hey, I saw what happened back there. That didn't look okay to me. How do I support you moving forward? Right? That's still a message of accountability to the perpetrator as much as it's a message of help and support to the victim or survivor, right? So, but what it does is if you do it outside of the direct intervention, you do it when you've got those people one-on-one, you might get a different response than if you did it in that moment where the perpetrator is still in that victim space. So for me, my comfort is always to do something indirectly when I can. So even if, you know, the third one, you create a distraction. So you go over and say, sorry to interrupt, I'm just doing the coffee order. What type of coffee do you want? Hey, sorry to interrupt. Has anyone seen the code of conduct? I misplaced mine and I'm looking for it urgently. Whatever it might be to interrupt or disrupt what is happening, you can come back 15 minutes later, 3 days later, and say, hey, I saw what happened. Is everything okay? How do I support you? So you don't need to use one or the other technique, but distraction is sometimes a good thing for me so that I can shut down that moment for the person that's experiencing that. And then I can come back and do what I'm comfortable with once I've gathered my thoughts. I'm a firm believer in calling things what they are. So in saying to that perpetrator when you've got them on their own, what I observed looked like sexual harassment. If I were you, I would check out the code of conduct. So really calling it for what it is. The other thing that you can do that I often think works well in a workplace is sending out the code of conduct to your entire team. Hey, I was just having a reread of the code of conduct this morning and thought this would be good reading for everyone. I'm particularly interested in the values proposition of our sexual harassment policy. Let's have a discussion about it. Or sending out information that, you know, I went to this webinar today. We talked about being an effective bystander in all of these ways. I thought I'd share that information with everyone else here. So that's what we say about applying protocol. You might not feel comfortable doing that, but you might be able to send something to HR that says, hey, I've noticed some behavior in the workplace that I think constitutes sexual harassment. You might want to revisit. I don't want to, you know, I can't send anything further, but you might want to revisit. And that can be a whole of. I know during COVID, a lot of workplaces contacted us and said, how do we address some of the things that might go virtually into homes? What do we do about that? And Anushka and I were big fans of sending out company-wide emails that had information in them that you were that you wanted to get to specific cohorts. But instead of it being directed directly at those people, you were sending it to everyone, because osmosis is important as well. You also want key people in the organization that are going to call things out. So you want to do some workplace training and intervention that's all about culture and who creates culture. More broadly than the workplace, those same principles can be applied to your community, to your school, to your work, wherever it is that you are, you can do the same things. Anushka and I actually were going to the uni gym and we're listening to music there that was really highly inappropriate. So we got back to our desk, wrote an email saying that music's got to stop. There's, you know, young students that are going in there. There's me that's going in there. No one likes the music. It's disrespectful towards women. Change it, right? That's being an effective bystander. Sexual harassment doesn't happen in a bubble. It happens because we've received messages right throughout society that women are less than, they're not equal, and that they are there for those things to happen, right? So rigid gender stereotypes is a huge contributor to sexual harassment in the workplace. So helping your workplace or your community better understand what sits beneath the iceberg of sexual harassment, what keeps it there, what keeps it flourishing. The number one thing that the perpetrator wants of you is your silence or apathy. Your silence or your apathy, not really caring too much about. That's the number one and only thing a perpetrator relies on in society. So if we disrupt that in the workplace, in our community, in our schools, everywhere we go, at the fence with your neighbours, then that's how I believe we change culture. Nush, you know, I could keep talking all day, but I probably won't, because there's other people that need to talk.
Thanks, Shan. Great examples there. I think we'll come back to some of those in some questions, but let's hand over to Michelle, who's going to talk to us about responding and some channels to responding to sexual harassment in the workplace. Michelle?
Yes, thank you. So kind of following on from lots of the stuff that Shan says, I guess there will be a point in time where this information is given to you, and some of the formal channels that you might be able to deal with this within the workplace. So first of all, you might want to sit with the person if you've witnessed or a person's come to you to say that they feel like they've been sexually harassed in the workplace. You want to find a place where you can talk to them about what has happened, where they feel comfortable, you feel comfortable, and that conversation can be confidential. In that conversation, you absolutely want to validate their experience. As Tracy suggested, as Shan's covered, this can really be normalized. You can question yourself if you're a victim of sexual harassment. Is it really sexual harassment? Should I just, roll with it? This is what happens in our community. So you absolutely validate that experience, and you should validate the experience of reporting it formally as well, that it can be complex and that it can be a tricky process to do, because without bystanders standing by, it then comes to the victim having to do things for themselves to report this through formal chains at the workplace. So you should also do some research about your workplace in particular and what policies they have in place. So right across Australia, essentially under any workplace health and safety policy, there has to be some sexual harassment responses. Those responses, though, can be kind of opaque in that people need to feel safe, or they can be super explicit, in fact, leading to its own sexual harassment policies and procedures. So hopefully you're in a workplace where they've got lots of these really detailed, clear responses, but perhaps not. But nonetheless, every workplace has to respond to that to make sure you feel safe in the workplace. So doing some research around what the pathways are for that person to follow is really important. And then you can bring it to them so that they can make some good choices about what they want to do moving forward. It is really important to support their choices. This will be their part of the journey. And so Sian's spoken a lot about what you can do, and that is super critical. But when we come to this space, this is their journey, and you want to do what they want you to do. Whether that's support listening, whether that's them not doing anything at this stage, whether that's coming back later to do something, all of that is okay. But you need to validate that this is sexual harassment. It's not appropriate in the workplace. The workplace has to respond to this. And these are the pathways that you can do that if you choose. The other thing that's really handy, whether they choose to do it at that, choose to make a formal complaint or follow some other process at that point, is documentation. So dates, times, who was present, particular details can really help if they're going to make a complaint at that process, at that point, or yourself if you're the victim, or at a later date. So months later, having that history to reflect upon can be really helpful to helping to formally hold people accountable for sexual harassment in the workplace. If the person themselves feel unsafe about approaching their manager, their supervisor, or their HR department, which usually are the key places that you would go to, but again, do the research for your own organisation. If they feel uncomfortable about that, you can, if you're part of a union, approach your union about what supports they might be able to offer you in that space. And then there are lots of external bodies that you can go to as well, such as Fair Work Australia, where you can raise your concern and your reason why you don't want to report that in the workplace specifically, because they will explore with you why that perhaps wasn't your first step. But if you have really good information as to why you didn't feel safe doing that process, then there are outside opportunities that you can use as well. So you've witnessed it. The reporting process has gone through. This can be quite a long journey. So I guess sticking with that support factor of what that person wants is most important. But even as that journey is going, doing these bystander things that Sian's already covered off are really important. Talking to your manager about sexual harassment policies, talking to your HR department about wanting some explicit processes if you don't have it in place, having awareness days, bring it up at the next team meeting, talking about it on a regular rotation. Some of those things Sian's already said about sending out company-wide emails around these things, inviting people to be part of a workshop of whether they think the current policies and processes are helpful for their workplace and what they might make different. Just help the world to talk about this and to name this and to move the other way from saying that that's normalised or behaviour that we're going to be silent on or be apathetic about. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. Beautiful explanation there. I have a question for you. And this comes up quite a lot for us dealing with organisations. I know that we're talking to people as employees here now, but in terms of policies, what type of what provisions in a policy are best supportive of the bystander to anonymously take action? Does that exist? What should we be looking for in a policy that, as bystanders, that we know we're going to be supported?
Well, I guess this is where things can get complex when you're following up a direct experience of sexual harassment, in that it has to be really about that person and not the bystander per se. But you want your organisation to have things like standalone policies, to have posters, to have things that really pull out that sexual harassment isn't okay. So it's not just in the code of conduct, it's not just in a work-safe workplace, where they really are explicit. Because I know I shouldn't trip over something. I know my electrical devices should be checked once a year. Like, they're things that we expect from our workplace, that I'll get PPE if I'm on a job site. But we don't explicitly know as a society that if someone sexually harasses me, that I have a right to feel safe from that at work. So they're the things that you really want to see. You want to see the explicit naming of sexual harassment, and then some support documentation, just like what Tracy covered off at the beginning about what sexual harassment is, because it can feel really normalized in many, many workplaces. And so you do have to name it, and you have to have those conversations about it.
Beautiful. Yes, naming it is so important. And I think even just recognising that there is a standalone sexual harassment policy and that it has been, I guess, at least reviewed recently is always a good start. Sian, maybe a question for you. What happens, or what can you do if the person who's using the sexual harassment is the manager or the team leader or the supervisor or your boss?
Thanks for giving me the easy question, Nush. Grateful for that. Yeah, it's often, you know, the reason why that question is so important, Nushka, is because we hear it all the time. We hear people all say it's the CEO, it's the senior advisor, and or it's our clients, and we don't want to lose the business. So firstly, I would be concerned about the values of that organisation if they're putting profit above people, first and foremost. And also I'd be concerned if there wasn't any performance management or conduct conversations and or whatever needs to happen in relation to that person's conduct. But if say you're new to the organisation and you come there and you see behaviour that you think constitutes sexual harassment, a really great way a non-confrontational way to address that might be to say, wow, that type of behaviour would never have washed in the workplace I just came from. Is this common here? Does this happen often here? That's really concerning to me, right? Because it's again non-confrontational, but it highlights to people who have perhaps been working in that organisation for a very long time that that's not the norm. That's not what happens elsewhere, and it certainly wasn't accepted elsewhere. Another thing that I would say is finding, like, I loved everything Michelle said in relation to supporting that person who's receiving that. This is her journey. It's important to her that you provide your support and that she guides what she wants from both the process and the outcomes. Because there are many reasons why women don't want it to go any further, right? There's concerns about job loss, there's concerns about making matters worse, there's concerns about where that might then lead, right? There's also concerns for physical safety, and the list goes on if we had 10 hours. But there's so many reasons why not. So it's really important that as a bystander, our role is to support that woman who's receiving that, and not to jump at a pace that doesn't feel safe for that woman. Actually, not to jump at that at all. That's up to her to do. But as a bystander, I always work in, and those of you, probably Tracy has seen me do this, I will often work in hypotheticals. So I will often phone an organisation or wherever and say, hey, I just want to see what everyone else might think about this. I need some advice around this. So it might be that you would have phoned, if you saw this, observed this happen as a bystander and it's someone in a senior position, phoning Women's Legal Service or somewhere like that and saying, hey, I've got a hypothetical. Is there someone I can just talk to for a couple of minutes to get my head around what I think I might be seeing? And you can do that anonymously. You don't have to give any information up. But I also think that there's something to be said about safety in numbers. You're not the only person that has observed that behavior, but you in your leadership approaching someone else and saying, are you concerned about what you are seeing as well? I'm certainly concerned about the behavior that person's displaying. Are you? That person might say, yeah, I've never known what to do about it. Okay, well, together, let's do something about it, right? So it's sometimes there's a real benefit in doing that. Again, so long as what you were doing is comfortable, feels safe and comfortable to the person that's receiving that violence, but also bearing in mind that the culture around you, you're responsible for. So I love that Michelle supported the idea of sending out company-wide emails. Recently, Anushka, we worked with an organisation where a new very senior member started in that organisation, sent out an email on his first day saying, here I am, welcome. And someone within that organisation emailed him back individually, personally, and said, the email that you just sent out was not inclusive, made me feel X, Y, and Z. I wanted to let you know. I wanted to do the right thing, let you know on your first day that we're an inclusive organisation, right? So this is a person way above the person that did it. The person then sent an email to everyone company-wide and said, I made a mistake. Someone has just held me accountable for my behaviour. I want to rectify that. I will do better. I will commit to doing X, Y, and Z. So to me, I go, if you have the privilege of not being the victim of that violence, but of being someone that gets to sit on the periphery and see it unfold, then the responsibility lies squarely with you to do something about that. So for me, if it was values-based versus saving my next paycheck, I know what I'd rather do, because again, the perpetrator relies on you doing absolutely nothing, and that victim is further victimized by a culture that doesn't support them. So if that's what I know that doing nothing, if that's where I know doing nothing results in, then I can't be the person that sits there and does nothing. That was really long-winded, Nush. I'm not talking again.
It was very helpful though. So
if I could jump in on that, that's a really great point about policies and procedures. They're very powerful in workplaces. Documentation is really important. It's powerful because it sends a message, but sometimes it's also our block. So if you're sitting alongside someone who has experienced sexual violence and they're not doing anything because the process isn't going to work for them, well, let's go and work on that process. Let's say this process isn't helpful. And what can we do about it? Let's share the information that we have as fellow people in different levels who don't know HR, who don't know paperwork, who don't know this, that, and the other, to say this isn't working. How can we make this work? Because a piece of paper then becomes worth nothing. In fact, becomes problematic in and of itself if it isn't facilitating a good process.
Absolutely. Yeah, love that. And hearteningly, we get lots of organizations approach us and say, we don't get many sexual harassment complaints, but obviously there's an issue. So that in and of itself is an issue, right? So how do organizations know what the culture is and what people are experiencing unless people report it and unless people are feeling safe enough to be able to say, here's where I don't feel safe and here's why I don't even want to report it, or why other people are not reporting it, if you're saying that as a bystander. But ultimately, we need that culture where people feel safe to be able to say that, and that's the role of all of us to be able to do that. Because as bystanders, if we are effective and we're supportive of people, then we'll know that other people in the organisation are feeling like that because they would have said something to us, or we've been able to feel that from them too. Probably a question to all of you, and you've all touched on this in some way, shape or form, because we've talked about the normalization of sexual harassment in our culture, but in particularly in male-dominated fields and sectors and industries, sexual harassment is rife mostly because it's seemingly harmless, right? It's those normalized behaviors that are so entrenched in day-to-day life. How can people still deal with that? Tracy, do you have anything to add there?
I was just thinking, and I was thinking back to Michelle's comment around having policies and procedures around addressing that behavior, because I guess if you're talking about those industries where there's a large representation of males, then part of those, even trying to call out that behavior will be really challenging, because again, then there's those stereotypes that support what is it to be male and masculine. So what are the things that you can put up with? What are the behaviors that you can stand up to actually say this is not appropriate? So I suppose it's having that, I guess, starting that conversation where the organization takes a standpoint around what behaviors are we defining as unacceptable and inappropriate, and follow that with policies and procedures around when that happens, and allowing the environment to be able to respond to those disclosures where people feel they're being harassed in that workplace. So I suppose it's actually creating an environment that supports people to, one, identify that or talk about it, and definitely be sure that that will be followed up. There will be actions attached to those complaints when they come up.
Yeah, Sian or Michelle, anything to add?
I feel like in male-dominated industries, the bystander is the most powerful, and starting that conversation at all levels, just subtly starting to call it out as not being okay, or not making those comments with the real. most of my experience has been in human services organisations, which is dominated by women, and it sort of already has this open door to talking about sexual harassment. But I do have some exposure to really male-dominated fields. And in fact, my experience of sexual harassment was in a male-dominated field, and it did not go well. And the subtle conversations really start that cultural change. And that's where it really has to go, because victims are never going to feel comfortable raising a complaint, because they will be called out for it in a variety of ways. Job losses being the weird one, you know, making sure, oh, well, we've got to be proper around her, she's not one of us, some of those situations. So I think bystanders and bystanding everything in a male-dominated workplace is really important. Using
so
out as a verb.
You're right. You're so right. I was actually speaking to a woman just yesterday. She's a survivor of domestic violence. She is now working. She's an actor, and thanks to COVID, she was very quickly no longer an actor. And she's now working in underground mine as the only woman on a team of about 15 men. And she said exactly that. It only takes one of them to say, "Come on, mate, that's a bit inappropriate," or "that's a bit off," or "don't really know about that." And the behavior stops. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't cause a scene. She said it only takes one of them in any situation to make her feel more safe and more included and more like she belongs. And I think that's such a powerful example of what you're saying, Michelle. That's just one person, and then eventually the people who are using the poor behavior will become the minority, right?
Yeah, no, Shen, I think language is such a really big part of this. As bystanders, we may not even feel like we can do those things at that end, at that pointy end where sexual harassment is occurring, but we might feel like down here we can pull up language that objectifies, that speaks to women being lesser. I know, working in organisations where, you know, patriarchal male-dominated organisations, where men used to use words that were dehumanizing towards women, and they would say it in jest and in jokes to each other. Again, like you and Michelle just said, if it just took one man to say, "Nah, I'm not cool with that, don't use that language around me," then that sets culture, right? But I also recognize my privilege in the work that I do in working with men. I'm a white, cisgendered, straight woman with the privilege of all the things that come with that. And so I have a responsibility to ensure that that this goes beyond sexual harassment, and that we're talking about anything in an organisation that makes someone feel like they're less than and that they're not equal, because that same set of behaviours is what results in sexual harassment. That same thought pattern that racism is a tiny bit okay, or transphobia is a tiny bit okay, or whatever it might be, is that same excuse. So if you can pull it up at language and jokes, if you can get that bit really good in an organisation, because I tell you, your policies and procedures are not worth the paper they're written on if I don't feel safe coming forward, because I hear the language that my colleagues use in the lunchroom and it doesn't feel safe. So, you know, for me, when people say, how do we as a workplace show our values? Well, anyone that works for you doesn't use language that disempowers anyone around them. So yeah, to me, that's, I suppose, what I would love the takeaway to be. And I wish I had have known that as a 21-year-old going into a very patriarchal organization, that I did have power in the use I did have power in perhaps influencing language, but I didn't know it. And I wish I had have, because I perhaps could have made some changes there. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. And I love that and I know that you and I talk about this a lot, Shan, is that importance of language and inclusive language in an organisation, in a community, in a school, wherever we are, that biases and perceptions start with language. So we've got to start to really go there. We have Kane joining us today. He's from he is an ambassador for an app called Word Witness. Kane, would you like to share a bit about that with the group?
Yeah, I would welcome everybody and appreciate the opportunity to have a bit of a chat. And one of the things that the app that I'm involved with is called Word Witness, and it works on the basis that a lot of victims in sexual harassment in the workplace, domestic family violence, victims are first of all afraid of being believed. They're very apprehensive of the memories of the trauma on multiple occasions that they've gone through. And when they do go to particularly an employer, the employer wants to act, but needs to launch the investigation. And as I think one of the other speakers just said, when an investigation starts, the behaviour becomes a lot more covert. And it then moves into there are no witnesses. It'll happen in a corridor. It'll happen, outside of normal working hours. And that makes it even harder for a lot of victims to go, look, I can bring it forward, but it's just going to be a he said, she said type arrangement. So this app is designed for someone to install on their phone. It's a password protected app that allows them to just take notes of various instances of something that they've seen as a bystander or something that has happened to them. It's then time locked, which means that once you've saved the note, it's verified that it happened then and there. So if in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, that victim does decide to go to HR, they can easily forward a PDF of those various instances, and then HR can then produce that PDF when they're doing the investigation, making it a lot harder for a perpetrator to then go and say, it never happened, because HR's now got a written PDF that says, no, at 11:15 on Tuesday morning, you walked down the corridor on level 2, walked past such and such desk, this is what you said. Then 3 days later at 2:15 p.m, you walked out of the lunchroom and you did this. And from the people that we've been working with, when they have presented that to a perpetrator, the perpetrator changes their behaviour. So rather than saying it never happened, it's almost as if they go, okay, yeah, I'm now seeing that that's bad behaviour. And that brings about a whole different conversation around how do we fix that? How do we get the right support for the victim or other victims? And then how do we adjust the behaviour of a perpetrator so that behaviour doesn't happen in the workplace? Because I think, as someone has said, there's a lot of people who work in these organisations who genuinely don't know that their behaviour is causing, so much harm to other men, other women, and the culture of the organisation in entirety. So anyway, that's my little speech. But everything you guys have been saying this morning is fantastic. So I just wanted to let everybody know about that app that's available on the App Store, if that's appropriate for anyone to use.
Thanks, Kane. That sounds amazing. That's really great. And I love that what you're finding is that the byproduct of that is actually behaviour change, hopefully long-term behaviour change, right? Because there's very little room to hide if they're, and prompting accountability, which is always what we want to see. Wow. I don't think there's any other questions, unless anyone on the panel would like to make a comment before we close out. It is very, I love having these conversations. I love hearing from people like you all, particularly Michelle and Tracy, and your experience. I love bringing that into these conversations so that bystanders are more empowered and more motivated to act and be someone who does something. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I love that Kane brought up an app. Because we are also working on an app to support bystanders, supporting people experiencing or using domestic and family violence. So that will be available to everyone. Hopefully, I'm not actually going to give you a date, but in the coming months. And we'd be really excited and really happy for you to let us know what you think about that when that is also available on the app stores, and whether you find it helpful and if there's anything that we need to add or change to that. But we hope that it does help to empower people to do something. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this conversation. Please join next week's DV Connect webinar that they're hosting. and there are support numbers in the chat if you feel like you need to reach out for support. Thank you so much. Once again, have a great day.